Good afternoon, Lynette Oxley here for Tax Shack Tactical TV. Today we are with Ricky Mann. He has submitted a 137-page document. His comments on the proposed changes to the Firearms Control Act. Ricky, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Cool, thanks very much for having me, Lynette.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm 32 years old, born and bred in Johannesburg. Proud firearm owner and member of Tax Shack and GOSA. I finished up school in 2006, went straight through to Wits University. I did a Bachelor of Commerce in Business Finance and Economic Science. I then stuck around, I did a Bachelor of Economic Science with honours, and then I did a Master's in Economic Science. After I finished studying, my first job was with the Department of Economic Development as an economist, and I worked for an agency called the Competition Commission. So that was very interesting. It kind of exposed me to government policy, policy making, enforcement of government policy, and kind of some of the mechanics behind, let's say, government thinking. After my 5 years at the Commission, I have moved on. I've been at a private consulting firm for the past 3.5 years. So I'm doing the same sort of thing, which is basically applied microeconomics. But instead of working on behalf of government, I'm working on behalf of private clients. I'm also a guest lecturer at the Mandela Institute School of Law at the University of Witwatersrand. And so just collectively, I think my experience and my background is that my focus is on data and let's say data analytics, particularly with a focus on economics. But the line of work that I'm involved in, there's a lot of cross-pollination with the law. Because a lot of the work that we do and we prepare ultimately goes through to the court and is tested before either tribunals, high courts. I've done work in other jurisdictions as well, in the UK, before the European Commission, and throughout the rest of Africa. So I've picked up a lot about law and structured legal analysis, and I'm also married to a lawyer. So
that's interesting. And by the way, for the viewers, fantastic. He shoots really, really good. So it's very interesting to see the other side. I always just see you on the range, so it's nice to see the other side.
A little bit of a nerd when it comes to these things.
You don't look like a nerd on the shooting range. No, not at all. Any case, you submitted this 137-page document. It's single space, small font. It's a hell of a body of work. What inspired you to do that?
Sure. So it's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for it because it might sound a bit crazy, but I have a real passion for science and for the scientific method. And part of that entails empirical analysis or data analysis from the real world to try and test hypotheses and claims that people might make. So that is coupled with my other passion, which is sort of for political science. And that's tied to my passion for firearms. It all kind of comes together. And this was, I think, an opportunity for me to explore outside of work, in my own personal capacity, the things that I was very passionate about and to apply some of the things that I know. So I think that's kind of like the high level nutshell answer. But I think maybe there are some other important reasons. When I take a look at the landscape of firearm owners today, there are a large number of courageous groups fighting the good fight against these amendments and just in general on behalf of firearm owners. GOSA, of course, being the major one, and many other associations. But I saw, I would say, somewhat of a gap in some of the work that's being done. A lot of the analysis that's coming out of let's call it the anti-gun lobby, which includes a variety of different groups, which we'll discuss later, a lot of it seems to be aimed at more technical-minded people. And the problem is that those conclusions tend to get picked up by the minister and they sound very persuasive and very sweet. And so they kind of make their way into the decision maker's mind. I haven't really seen a significant body of work that has challenged those research reports. And given my background, I thought, again, this is a good opportunity to actually directly address that. And then I think probably a third reason is hopefully, as I've said before, I can't be the only econometrician or statistician that's also a firearm owner. I'm sure there are other passionate people out there. And hopefully, this is some inspiration or at least a catalyst to get others involved and to address and to attack the same issues, which is this kind of underlying research data body of work which seems to be misleading on the face of it, but is it really misleading? And so, at least in part of my report, I spent at least 40 to 45 pages just interrogating 5 of these major research papers, but there are many more, and I think that's the next step.
Because ultimately it comes down to it's a political fight.
Yeah.
And what the politicians do is ultimately influencing what we have our rights in terms of firearms.
Yes, yeah.
So that's where it all ends up in the end.
Yes, yeah.
Why do you say the proposed changes to the Firearms Control Act is materially flawed?
Okay.
What in a nutshell, can you try and do it in a nutshell?
Okay, sure. The Firearms Control Act is a piece of administrative power. And all administrative power is subject to, I would say, to review or subject to certain threshold tests. And these tests are put in place to safeguard our constitutional rights from an abuse of that administrative power. So there are 2 threshold tests that I looked at. And the reason I segmented them into 2, some people may say they are one test or there are different aspects to this. But it was, I segmented it into 2 because it's a neat way to segment the evidence supporting each of these tests. But of course, you could look at them maybe as one test or slice and dice it in many different ways. So the first test deals with arbitrary power. Now, a piece of policy or legislation would be arbitrary if, when viewed objectively, there's no connection between the means and the ends, or at least the objectives that are sought by that policy. So let me give you a useful but strange example. If we wanted to reduce motor deaths on the road, and I decided to put together some policy which said people are only allowed to own 5 chickens, you can clearly see there's no connection between the ownership of chickens and reducing deaths on the road. So that's an extreme example, but that's sort of where the test is going. And this is known as the rationality test. So if there's no objective connection, then the piece of policy would be deemed to be irrational. And it would be deemed to be irrational because it's arbitrary, so there's no connection. Now, arbitrariness undermines one of the fundamental constitutional principles of the rule of law. So if there's no rational connection, the policy would be arbitrary, and that would undermine the constitutional foundations. And so on that basis alone, the policy should be dismissed. So that's the one, it's an abuse of of administrative power that I looked at. Now, the main piece of evidence supporting that abuse is the socio-economic impact assessment, which we can get onto just now.
Absolutely.
It's been picked apart by others, but I think I can maybe add a few extra additional points and critiques on that, which could be helpful. The second abuse is an unjustified limitation of our constitutional rights, as per Section 36 of the Constitution. So like I say, you might include the rationality test in that, but I've separated it.
So what does Section 36 say?
So Section 36 says our rights are not absolute, and we accept that that is part of our law and part of any constitutional, let's say, regime. Our rights are not absolute and they can be limited, but they should only be limited under certain circumstances. And if they are limited, then the decision makers, or at least the administrators who are actually putting this piece of legislation together, need to justify that. Now, this justification is slightly different to the rationality test. This is rather called a reasonableness test. And the reason it's called a reasonableness test is because, again, there may be reasons as to why the limitations make sense. This is a much stricter test than the rationality test, so it requires a more careful balancing and reading of the evidence. But what's helpful about this is that the Constitution in Section 36 and through other case law tells us what are the relevant criteria to determine whether the limitation is justified. So I looked at some of these things, and I think we can summarize them as follows. The one issue is, what are the costs and benefits of the policy? Obviously, if the costs outweigh the benefits, it's not justifiable. Part of that is thinking about, will the policy actually achieve the objective? So going back to our little chicken example,
motor vehicle example,
the number of chickens you own, even if that policy was implemented, would have no impact
Absolutely.
on road debt. So you're not going to achieve it anyway, and therefore the policy just becomes a wasteful, costly piece of legislation. And I think the third important thing is whether there are less intrusive ways to achieve the stated objective. So again, we can think about, just common sayings like, you're not going to use a sledgehammer to smack a nail, right? You can use a hammer. The reason is that the sledgehammer probably is quite costly. And if you miss the nail with a sledgehammer, you're going to damage what's around it. So, using over-intrusive policy to try and achieve a stated objective should be avoided because that is unreasonable. So the reasonableness test, you can see, requires a little bit more thinking, a little bit more evidence and a greater analysis. So for that, I considered things like the socio-economic impact assessment, still relevant. Yeah. But here, the Ministry of Police report from 2015, 2016 was very important. Public comments made by the minister might be an indication of why the amendments could be justified, or other comments by other anti-gun organisations. All of these things are relevant pieces of evidence. The Wits report, very useful.
Very useful, which was hidden from public for a very long time for specific reasons.
Exactly. I think it's it can't just be a strange coincidence that a year later the ministry report came out, which references and cherry picks pieces of the Wits analysis and ignores the main conclusions, which is that policing is the primary, and like we say, so this is important because a less intrusive way to reduce crime is to improve policing.
So they're trying to use a sledgehammer for a problem that doesn't need the sledgehammer.
It doesn't need the sledgehammer. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I could just say that if the Control Act, if the amendments don't pass the rationality test, that should be the end of the story.
Yeah.
If it does, it's then subject to the reasonableness test. And if it doesn't pass the reasonableness test, then essentially you have a piece of unconstitutional legislation.
Okay.
And therefore, on that basis, the FCA and the evidence on which the FCA is based on is materially flawed and should be discarded, or at the very least should be redrafted after further extensive consultation with firearm owners who were not consulted, and we know that as well.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads to another very important point, which I also did put in probably one of the first pages of my report, which is why are public comments so important? Ministers are not exposed to the same problems that we are. Not that they're not subject to crime, but we're subject to different levels of crime.
And they've got VIP protection,
which
makes a massive difference.
Exactly.
Big difference.
So public comments are crucial, and so I think if this process is to continue, absent comments from firearm owners, it would be severely flawed.
Absolutely, and that's I think where GHOST is also going with this campaign that they have, We the People, because we the people are pretty important in terms of what decisions gets made.
Yeah. So that's also consistent with the reasonableness test, right? So the reasonableness test in full says, can these limitations be justified in an open and democratic society? Because, of course, they could be justified in a tyrannical society. Absolutely. But we don't live in a tyrannical society. We're trying to safeguard our democracy. So it needs to be justifiable in an open and democratic society. And I actually think that the extensive comments that are going through to the minister is indicative of working and functioning democratic society. And so the minister should stick within that framework.
There was an amazing number of comments. It was it was huge.
What was the total number? Close to 200,000 somewhere.
It was around that figure.
Yeah, I think when I looked at the DRSA site, I may be mistaken, but I think the number of comments even on the amendment to the Constitution regarding expropriation without compensation was only about 15,000.
So this is important.
This is big,
This was big.
Yeah.
I think GHOST has got a lot to do with it. We are trying to get out there and see that that we don't that our firearm rights, our rights to life, doesn't get taken away from us.
Sure.